This episode of Life Trippin' is called Stepping Onto the Road, Part 1, the first part of an interview about vulnerability with my friend Gayle Greenslade Ely. To trip or not to trip? That is the question. In terms of podcasting, this may be the first time, but doubtfully the last, that I channel my inner Lord of the Rings geek. I've probably read the books at least 6 times, not counting the number of times I've listened to the audiobooks, nor how many times I've seen Peter Jackson's mostly terrific films. Don't get me started on how the Hobbit movies turned out, though. Years ago, I wrote, but never published, an article about the meaning that I found in that trilogy entitled My Journey with the Lord. I'm still kind of proud of that title, and I was sort of miffed when a guy who wasn't me wrote The Gospel According to Tolkien. So, Dana, what does all that have to do with Life Trippin'? Well, those books only describe what is, for me, maybe the best hero's journey since the Odyssey. There's so much there about fear and despair, but also about conviction, connection, and the ability of the ordinary to become heroic. One of my favorite lines gives this episode its title. Bilbo's talking to his nephew Frodo about journeys, and Frodo has a kind of traveling Jones. He wants to experience the world all at once with no real sense of the risks. His uncle cautions him, "It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." This episode focuses on what might keep us from going out the door, from taking those first, admittedly risky steps at any stage of our life trip. What this won't be is a retelling of the movie Failure to Launch, because no matter how much you like Matthew McConaughey, Sarah Jessica Parker is just a terrible role model for life coaches in that movie. Actually, there don't seem to be any good portrayals of life coaches in movies. Maybe that'll be my next step. Life Trippin' the movie. Well, maybe not. Recently, my friend Gayle Greenslade Ely and I had a great conversation about how our willingness and ability to be vulnerable plays a huge role in our life trips. Gayle is a certified professional coach in the Atlanta, Georgia area and a friend from our coach training days. Her insights about vulnerability and the costs of avoiding it are still resonating with me several days after our interview. I loved the interview and had so much trouble editing it down that I just decided to split it into 2 and share the whole thing. So here's part 1. So I'm talking with Gayle, and one of the reasons that I came to reach out to Gayle was that my sense is that all of us in one way or another are afraid at times to step onto the road, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, not only for fear of where we might be swept off to, but for fear of falling, failing, crashing. All of those things, I believe, relate to our ability and our willingness to be vulnerable, to make ourselves vulnerable. And there is this wonderful Brené Brown TED Talk on YouTube, and I'm going to post a link to that TED Talk on the Life Trippin' website. But I have to say that it's way more than coincidence that Gayle and I connected around that. In fact, Gayle sent me a link to that TED Talk, which I have already watched several times and referred to my own clients. So I mention it to all of you who might be listening to definitely check that out. So you are our resident Brené Brown. So you are expert on vulnerability, and so I would start by asking you how you would describe vulnerability.
Well, David, hey, thanks for asking me to be on this today. I'm really excited to be with you all, and really, I do give credit to Brené Brown for a lot of what I'm going to say today because I really am a fan of hers, and I really embrace her work. So I just want to say that up front. So a lot of this is not original to me, but I am happy to share it. And so how would I describe vulnerability? I would describe it as daring to show up and let yourself be seen. It's about engaging in life. It's about understanding the necessity of both victory and defeat and just basically being all in to life. Brené Brown actually defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And that's, that sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, all of that stuff's scary.
And yet she also says it's the core, the heart, the center of meaningful human experiences. And the reason that's the case is because we are wired for connection. I mean, literally, I think we're created to be in connection with one another. So one of the things I like to go through, which she goes through in her book called Daring Greatly, is what are the myths about vulnerability? Would it be all right if I share
please, yeah, great.
Okay. So the first one is, and lots of people believe this, is that vulnerability is a weakness. In fact, if you think about it, when you're interacting with somebody and they are really showing up in that way that, that they're really allowing themselves to be seen, we like that in other people. But we are afraid to be that, which I find really interesting, because I think for me, what's happening is that person, I'm really connecting with that person who's being vulnerable. However, I'm afraid to be vulnerable in order for them to connect with me. But I think we really love that in other people, but it is not a weakness. It's courageous to show up and be daring when you say, I love you to somebody and you don't know if they're going to say it back. Mm-hmm. It's courageous to put yourself out there. It's courageous to admit that you're afraid and that you really have faith. So that doesn't sound like weakness to me. It sounds more like, and this is what Brené Brown would say, it sounds more like truth, and it feels like courage. That's what vulnerability really is.
Sounds like truth and feels like courage.
Sounds like truth and feels like courage. Wow. Yeah. Number 2 is that some people believe that we don't all experience vulnerability. But the truth is that life is vulnerable. Whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to face it or not, life is vulnerable because it's filled with uncertainty. What happens is, and what leads us to believe that we're not being vulnerable, is that we avoid it. We avoid those kinds of things. We avoid uncertainty. We avoid emotional exposure. But what ends up happening is when you avoid something, you sometimes end up doing things that don't really align with who you are. And some of the ways we avoid vulnerability are by things like drug use, alcohol use, overeating, being a workaholic, are ways that we avoid being vulnerable, but we all experience it. The myth is that we don't experience it, we do. So the third thing is vulnerability means spilling all your secrets. I've had a number of conversations with people who will either use the word vulnerability or authenticity and say, what does that mean? I just got to, spill my guts to everybody that comes along. And actually, no, it does not mean that. Vulnerability is actually about showing our feelings and our experiences with people, and this is what Brené would say, who have earned the right to hear them. And it takes courage to do this because we're wired for connection. And connection doesn't mean that we connect with everybody. There are people that haven't earned the right, for our trust in order to be in that inner circle where we can be vulnerable with them. So that's the other big myth is you just go around, being vulnerable to everybody and everything. No, there are boundaries that you set around vulnerability, and that's really important to understand.
So just out of curiosity, what are some of the ways that others would earn that trust from us? They have to show you that they're worthy of being of having earned that right to hear them, and they have to earn your trust. They have to be responsible with the information you do share with them. They have to really understand. I mean, so you don't start out by just exploding vulnerability, even on somebody you think might be part of your inner circle. You do some small things and just see how they are. You have to experience and be in relationship with them. Well, that could I could see, as you described that, potentially just opening up the floodgates could be overwhelming to someone, especially if they're not prepared for it as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think because we're wired for connection, and we don't know how to do it well. Sometimes we do that, and then we scare people. Yeah, and then we put ourselves in a place in which, it's more likely that we're not going to get what we want in terms of connection when we don't know how to do it well, when we don't know how to do it within the boundaries.
What are some other things that you think of when you think about what gets in the way of folks being vulnerable and as a result connecting, gets in the way of them connecting with others?
Sure. Well, there are 3 things that Brené Brown talks about in her book, Daring Greatly, again. And the first one is a rather interesting one, I think. It's called foreboding joy. And I call that the too good to be true syndrome. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
Or worry that the other shoe's going to drop, if you will. That's another way to phrase it. It's about, when joyful things happen or things happen in your life that are really good, not really being able to celebrate them because you're afraid it won't last.
And the truth is that it won't last, right? But
exactly.
if you're focused on the time that it's already going to be gone, then you're not enjoying it in that moment at all.
Yeah. And there are people who say, I expect the worst, so I won't be surprised. Right?
Yep. I had a parent like that, actually.
Okay. And so people find themselves rehearsing tragedy. It reminds me of when my mom passed away. She was 58 when she passed away very suddenly. She had a stroke, and that jolt of unexpected tragedy caused in me kind of, for years, when I thought my husband should be home from work and he wasn't, I would immediately go to, oh my gosh, what if? What if something terrible happened to him? So we can find ourselves rehearsing tragedy that comes in those moments when life is really good. It's when Brené Brown asked, when she was interviewing people as part of her research, she asked them, what makes you feel vulnerable? And what she expected to hear was negative stuff, things around fear, things around shame. And what she got was things like, I love my job. How does that make you feel vulnerable? Well, you might lose it. You never know. Or, I feel really vulnerable when I acknowledge how much I love my spouse. Because you might get hurt.
Yep.
Parents would say to her, I feel the most vulnerable when I'm standing over my children while they're sleeping. Experiencing the love that they experience and fearing for what could happen to them. That's called foreboding joy. And it's actually something that gets in the way of vulnerability.
Yeah, it's almost like as you described it, it strikes me kind of like a shadow of vulnerability. I mean, it's not really the kind of vulnerability that you're describing, but lots of people maybe see that as, well, if that's vulnerability, then I don't really know if I want it because there's a lot of cost connected to it and I'm not really seeing the benefits.
Yeah. I mean, and another way to say it is I can't really celebrate or be joyful because it's not going to last or something bad could happen. And so they don't allow themselves to experience.
Yep.
Yeah. So the second thing that gets in the way of vulnerability is one that I am very familiar with because I am a recovering one of these. Okay. Perfectionism. Perfectionism is a way of, it gets in the way of vulnerability. Okay. And let me tell you what perfectionism isn't before we talk about what it is. Okay. Perfectionism is not about self-improvement. It's not about, okay, I'm going to do the best that I can do. Okay. That's not perfectionism. Perfectionism isn't a key to success. It actually can hamper your achievement. And it's about the fear of failing that keeps us from healthy striving. That's not what it isn't. It's not about healthy striving. It is not about healthy striving. It's not a way. Another thing is, it's not a way to avoid shame. It actually is a form of shame. Perfectionism is about, if I don't perform perfectly, then I am not worthy of connection with people. So what it is, it's self-destructive, and it's a self-destructive and an addictive belief system that fuels this thought. If I look perfect and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame.
So it's an effort to protect ourselves in a way, but it ends up doing just the opposite.
Well, yeah, because it's unattainable. Mm-hmm. Perfectionism is unattainable.
The bar is always moving.
Well, yeah, and to a place that we can't reach.
Right.
We are not perfect human beings, but what happens, and it becomes addictive, is because it becomes a pattern. Okay, that didn't go well. If I had just done better, maybe it would be better. So it becomes a pattern of, self-degradation, because if I just done better, you're never enough. You're never enough. And a perfectionist actually sets themselves up for shame, judgment, and blame, because, again, it's an unattainable goal, leaving them feeling like they're not good enough.
Yeah.
So that's, and that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Absolutely. I certainly can relate to that, both personally as part of my journey, although lots of folks would probably look at me and say, oh, you don't have much of that at all. But I would also more recently relate to it as a coach. And many, not all probably, but many of my clients have had at least elements of that voice, that message that they've received and accepted, that you're only really okay when you are at a certain level of whatever achievement, whatever the measuring stick is for them.
Yeah. And again, it's back to perfection is not, it isn't about wanting to do better and to be better. That's not perfectionism. That's a healthy striving. It's when your performance becomes tied to your own self-image that it really becomes a problem.
Good clarity. Thank you. Yeah.
So the third thing is that gets in the way of vulnerability is something called numbing. And numbing, a lot of people think immediately will go to things like drug use, alcohol use, even video game use, things like that, as a way to take off the edge of anxiety. That's what really numbing is. Numbing is taking off the edge. One of the interesting things that comes up that people don't really think about as numbing, because people brag about this kind of thing, is called crazy busy. Okay?
I've never said that.
Crazy busy, staying busy enough so the truth of your life doesn't catch up to you. Think about that for a minute.
Yep. Saying how busy you are so the truth of your life doesn't catch up to you.
Yeah.
I'm picturing somebody who's, at least in their minds, is running so fast that, and that's a good thing. It's like a distance runner, but it's also speed in there. And I'm going to stay just at least one step ahead of whatever fear it is that I have that may be catching up to me.
Yeah. And it's a lot. I don't know how many meetings I go to, and I say, "How are you?" And they say, "Busy. I'm busy. I'm really, really busy."
I used to say it in ministry. I mean, I'll be really honest, and that's something I hadn't thought about much. I did start thinking about it back then, and I stopped saying that. I read an article at one point where the author suggested that when we tell people that we're really busy, part of what we're telling them is that their concerns, their time really isn't a priority to us, which is a different twist, I think. But it goes to what you're saying about the numbing.
Yeah.
Because maybe not only are we really not all that busy, but maybe the world or our job, or in my case, our church, maybe they don't really even need me that much. And I want to make sure they believe that they need me.
There you go. And again, back to this idea that we're wired for connection to other human beings.
Yep.
Okay. Numbing means you don't have to lean into the discomfort.
Say a little bit more about that.
One of the things that is really critical to be in a place of vulnerability is that you recognize that there's going to be discomfort, that, or there's a potential for discomfort. And when it happens, rather than numb yourself, and I say this with my clients a lot, lean into it. Figure out what it's telling you. Feel it fully. Because here's the truth. If you, and nobody likes pain, okay? Nobody likes pain. The truth is that you cannot selectively numb your emotions. If you choose to numb your pain, you will numb your joy. I think that's one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. You cannot selectively numb your emotions. If you want to experience joy, you have to be willing to experience discomfort and pain.
It sounds so Zen-like. I mean, maybe not Zen-like, but certainly the concept of the yin and the yang.
Yes.
There's darkness within the light. There's light within the darkness.
That's exactly the way I think about it. You don't recognize light until you've experienced darkness, and vice versa.
Yep.
So it's along those same lines.
Yeah. So when people, for example, do any combination of these things, and I certainly have seen all of those in me at times and in others, but what are they missing?
You're missing out on joy.
Yeah. That's kind of a big one right there. That's
You're missing out on joy. But here's what Brené Brown says vulnerability is. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. So while it is something that it can be scary and difficult, we don't like uncertainty, we don't like to be emotionally exposed. The payoff is when we work toward that, maybe in a coaching relationship with you or me or, any of our colleagues, the payoff is we get to have that real sense of love and belonging. We get to experience joy. We get to see our creative side kind of go through the roof. And we get to experience empathy. Really, too. I mean, that's another part of it is you have to be connected to people to feel any empathy to them. But really, it's back to, we crave as human beings love and belonging, connection, that kind of thing.
The comment you just made was really striking to me, Gayle, because one of the things I tend to do a lot with folks, I end up working with a lot of folks around issues of self-care. And many of them are people who are very empathetic and caring. And I'm going to go back to kind of where you started, one of the first things that you talked about today in terms of, sometimes figuring out how and when and with whom you want to be vulnerable. And it strikes me that for many folks who are very compassionate, empathetic people, their challenge is not so much whether to be or not to be vulnerable, but rather how vulnerable to make themselves in what situations.
Yeah. And that is really tough, and particularly for people who are in caregiving professions. When I coach people who are in the caregiving professions around self-care, one of the most powerful things I do with them is to remind them that, first of all, probably it is part of their DNA and their makeup to be empathetic and to be caring for other people.
It's a gift, clearly.
It's a gift. And I say, don't deny that gift. But I also say to them, the real gift is in recognizing the need that is there for the person sometimes. The gift to yourself is to ask yourself the question, is it for me to do this caring thing for that person?
Yep, exactly. What do they choose? How do they choose to give?
The question is, is it for you?
Yeah.
To meet that need?
I've noticed that lots of times folks equate self-care with selfishness. One of the things I encourage them to look at is the reality of that. And for example, looking at things long term. Do they want to be a helping, empathetic, compassionate person in a long term way in which they're helping lots of people over a long period of time, or do they want to try to help everybody who enters their personal space, if you will, and potentially and frequently become compassion fatigued, as we sometimes say.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to what is the real gift that they have. The gift, for me, the gift that they have is that they are empathetic. They do see the need. There are other people. There are others that don't have that gift to see. So then again, it's back to a choice of how that need gets met, and it may be you, and it may not be you.
And the other thing that occurs to me is that if you can help folks to see that helping others, caring for others, and caring for ourselves are not mutually exclusive, and nor are joy and caring for others mutually exclusive, and that it's possible that they could experience both. Wow, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's it for part 1. Some of this is hard to talk about and maybe hard to hear. I'm reminded of a great podcast that Anna Sale does called Death, Sex, and Money, whose tagline is the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. If you haven't heard it, it's terrific. And Anna is a fellow West Virginian, so there's that. Maybe you don't think so much about vulnerability, but what if you did? What might you see differently or perhaps choose to change? Well, if you were listening and had some new insights or perhaps realized ways that your own fears of vulnerability might be putting your life trip on hold in some way, will you reach out, please? Send me an email to dana@lifetrippin.com, and we can talk about the possibility of some free life coaching and maybe recording a session for use on a future episode of Life Trippin'. I'm not going to make you wait 2 weeks for part 2, so look for it next week. The theme music is Road Trip by Phil Rivas, used on a Creative Commons license. And don't forget to look at the Life Trippin' website for information about guests, upcoming episodes, and more ways to contact me, Dana Sutton, the Life Trip Coach. Go to www.lifetrippin.com. And until next time, keep on trippin'.